When you think about what a victory for Taiwan and democracies around the world looking like, what do you see?
A solid little free democracy and 23 million people in Taiwan that exercise their daily right to be free. So I think it would be a much poorer and less freer world if Taiwan in its current form didn't exist.
They actually need to work with Taiwan because what happens in Taiwan, what happens in the Strait, peace and security directly affects European prosperity and European security. Welcome to Strait Forward, a podcast about Taiwan, the island at the center of technological innovation and the global fight for democracy. I'm Channing Lee.
And I'm Libby Lang. And Channing, I feel like this is the first week in a while where we have not had some kind of major travel plans coming up.
I know, it's great. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yeah, it feels like both of us somehow over the past couple of weeks ended up being in Europe, through happenstance. Neither of us planned that to be there around the same time, but I know both of us were looking around trying to find traces of Taiwan in Europe, you in Turkey and me in Spain, and had very different experiences with that.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because, Europe is a huge continent. Spain and Turkey are literally on opposite sides of Europe. There are Asian parts of Turkey too. So I thought it was so fun that we got to find these Taiwan nuggets in our travels.
But I feel like those two experiences also brought us to the realization that we should probably do an episode about Taiwan and Europe, right? Europe, of course, is in many ways a big player in Taiwan's future. And yet I think a lot of the time when we're talking about Taiwan and its international partnerships, especially here, we can get really bogged down in thinking about what is the U.S. doing, what can the U.S. do in those conversations. But really, I think there's a lot more to be unpacked when it comes to Europe and Taiwan.
Yeah, number one, it's shared values, right? And I think this was something that we might have come to the realization of around the world over the last few years, whether it's because of the war in Ukraine or otherwise. If we're in this global fight to preserve democracy, to fight for democracy, Taiwan and Europe actually make really good partners. And I think there was that global recognition in the last few years, and I know we'll get into that. But just from a purely values perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense for Taiwan and Europe to be doing more together.
Yeah, and I think we also see on the economic front, something we've talked about quite a bit, I think, on the podcast is how much Taiwan punches above its weight, right? And I think that's very true in Europe as well. Taiwan is, I believe, the 5th largest trading partner of Europe's in Asia, and given Taiwan's size compared to other countries, of course, that's very impressive. A lot of that is underpinned, of course, by Taiwan's chip industry that, is powering our modern world. And that is something that, especially in Europe, we've seen some really major strides in terms of cooperation. So I think most notably, we've seen Taiwanese chip companies are expanding operations in Europe and doing it hand in hand with European companies, right? We're seeing companies like TSMC announcing these new joint ventures. For instance, one that they just recently broke ground on, I believe maybe last year in Germany, ESMC. So you may notice
Very
a
nice
theme
name.
there. Yes. European Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is a joint venture with, I believe, 3 different European semiconductor companies.
I think economics has always been the underpinning of a lot of partnerships around the world. But, again, coming back to the values, coming back to the political support, I really do think there's been a shift in how Europe has thought about Taiwan, right? So maybe Taiwan's always thought about Europe in a more economic way too, but I think the values piece, the political support piece has increased a lot in the last few years. I think there has been a view in Europe that still remains today that Taiwan is just so far away. The Indo-Pacific is so far away. Europe, understandably, faces its own challenges in Russia, and they're literally still fighting a war right now. So not to, by any means, reduce that challenge, but I do think there has been this school of thought in Europe that, we have our own challenges. Our position, our place in the world is not to be mingling in the Indo-Pacific. But I think what a lot of other countries in Europe, especially those closer to Russia, have come to understand is that they actually need to work with Taiwan because what happens in Taiwan, what happens in the Strait, peace and security directly affects European prosperity and European security.
Yeah, but I think you made a great point earlier when you mentioned that Europe is a very big place. There are many countries with many different, definitions of what their national interest is. And so we've seen that difference, I think, reflected in how different countries have approached their relationship with Taiwan. So some, I think, have been very, very vocal and very forward about it. Lithuania in 2021, a Taiwanese representative office was opened there. And that's a big deal, right? Because oftentimes when Taiwan's sort of quasi-diplomatic offices are opened around the world, they, use names like the Taipei Taipei representative office or something
yeah,
like
just
that.
like here in DC or in LA or San
Exactly,
Francisco.
yes. The naming is always a little complicated, but the fact that they were able to use Taiwanese was actually quite a big deal diplomatically.
Yeah, same thing. I think when it comes to, when I think about Europe's biggest partner right now in Taiwan, it's actually the Czech Republic. Somehow, Czech Republic is still, quite a small country, but they are, talk about punching above their weight. They're doing a lot with Taiwan in terms of semiconductors. They are probably Taiwan's closest friends. They're working together on higher education. They're working together to advance innovation. They actually opened this advanced chip design research center last year in 2024. So the Czech Republic has been doing so much with Taiwan in a really impressive way.
Yeah, and people have probably seen that in the news, I believe, last year, that the Czech Republic was actually the first place that Taiwan's Vice President Xiaobi came visited after being elected in 2024. And of course, that made major headlines when it was later revealed that Chinese intelligence had actually planned some kind of, I think they described it as escalatory incident with the Vice President while she was there, which I think just reflects how important these partnerships are to Taiwan and how they're being seen by Beijing.
Yeah, former President Tsai also visited the Czech Republic as part of her first overseas trip after she was president. I remember she visited, I think, France and Belgium as well, but just
sounds like quite a nice trip.
I
do say so myself.
I would also take a European vacation after a tough job like that. But I do also remember, talk about headlines. When President Tsai visited the Czech Republic, she gave a major speech, and she also met Czech President Peter Pavel, which again is huge news because Taiwan, due to their diplomatic isolation, which we've talked about in past episodes, finds it very difficult to make these relationships.
So again, we could go really through the list of all the countries and all the things they're doing with Taiwan.
I do want to mention one other thing, or one last thing on this before we actually get into our conversation. The European Commission, the European Union, the European Parliament, all these larger European institutions have actually also been moving the needle. I would credit Ursula von der Leyen for a lot of this. She's the president of the European Commission, because I think as an institution, the EU bloc of institutions have actually been viewing Taiwan more as a strategic partner in their language. They've begun calling out Taiwan, which is new. They've also been not just calling out Taiwan, but referring to Taiwan as a like-minded partner. So all in all, very encouraging, I think, for the future of Europe-Taiwan relations.
No, that's a great reminder that the institutions all still matter too. But I think with that, we are very fortunate today to be joined by someone who has kind of that bird's eye view of what it's like pushing forward relations with Taiwan and Europe and why that's important for Europe. And so today we're very fortunate to be joined by Jonas Parello-Plesner. Jonas is the executive director of the Copenhagen-based Alliance of Democracies Foundation, a foundation that works to promote democracy around the world. And of course, Jonas himself has quite a background in Europe, China, and Taiwan. And so we're very fortunate to bring him on.
Jonas, thank you so much for joining us here in our studio in DC. You're like an OG friend of SCSP, so we're so happy to have you on. And a couple years later, also love to see what you've been up to. But really, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled. I love the podcast.
Well, we're so glad to hear that, especially coming from someone like you. Of course, you have so much experience across Europe, the U.S., and Asia in working on democracy issues. And you also recently published a book on Taiwan, The Battle for Taiwan. So congrats.
Thank you.
I would love maybe to just start by what, among all of your interests and all of your work, what got you interested in Taiwan?
In my current position heading a democracy foundation, it was really the fact that Taiwan is this isolated democracy that a lot of people, because of the one China policy, doesn't want to deal with. And so now that we could do that and we organized this yearly Copenhagen Democracy Summit, we basically, since the start in Europe, been including Taiwanese speakers, both from the government, but also from civil society. And so it's just been a sort of personal desire to be able to put Taiwan on the map. And beyond that, my Taiwan story also goes further back, that I was a serving diplomat as well and worked with China and Northeast Asia, which I was heading back in the zeros. And at that time, of course, I had to be a sort of dutiful servant of implementing I was working for the Denmark, like the one China policy and so on. So I don't know, maybe I feel I also owe Taiwan a little bit from that time, that I want really to bring them out in the limelight. And at that time we had all the usual diplomatic conundrums. You couldn't really meet very officially and all these things. I think I've seen many sort of facets of the Taiwan story. And then of course the personal fascination from being in Taiwan. One of my sons has studied in Taiwan as well.
Oh, really? That's so cool. Where at?
And well, he was doing this Mandarin language program in Taipei for, yeah. So it's just a lot of connections basically with Taiwan that makes me interested. And that was also why I wrote the book.
Yeah, and I know your book has a lot of interviews with some of the different people that you met in Taiwan. Do you have a personal favorite, something that you found really interesting?
Yeah, first of all, it was very much sort of book not to be sort of me coming and telling everything about Taiwan, because I don't know that. So it was very much based on Taiwanese voices of saying sort of each chapter, and there was a sort of red thread, which was very much on resilience after the war in Ukraine, asking the Taiwanese in different sectors how they saw that. I think personally most touching was the interviews I conducted with Taiwanese volunteer soldiers in Ukraine. So 2 young men that had been at the battlefield in Ukraine and basically kind of felt the whole geopolitics that we discussed in their bones. So they went immediately after Russia started the invasion in 2022. They went to Ukraine and sort of joined the fight as volunteers. And my interest got started when in November 2022, there was a young Taiwanese that died fighting in Donetsk. And that suddenly prompted me to think, there are actually Taiwanese doing that, and then found out during his funeral and onwards that there were more Taiwanese, and then started interviewing some of them. I think their testimonies that they gave to me, both of one of them really fascinating, Tony, who is a butcher from Taoyuan. He'd never been outside of Taiwan, and I was getting him to tell his whole story of how he'd come to Poland and how he had entered Ukraine. And at a certain point, I asked him, but how does this work out? You don't speak any Ukrainian, you don't speak actually English. So we did the interview also with the help of a Taiwanese friend in Mandarin. And so I was, how does it all work out? And then he said very endearingly, well, when you come and show solidarity, you don't need any language. The Ukrainians knew why I was there. And so their stories was for me really, I think, the most kind of personally touching, also because they were quite young men as well, so not that much older than my own sons as well.
Wow.
Well, that's really touching. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about your book in a bit as well. You make an important point, right? We've talked about the Ukraine war several times on this podcast, with Lorenz, for example, and how that's gotten a lot of attention around the world for Taiwan, but particularly in Europe. As we actually discussed in the intro for this podcast, the views about Taiwan across Europe are so different, from the Western Europe all the way to Central Europe to Eastern Europe, I think, based on various geopolitical factors, right? Different countries view Taiwan differently. So I'm wondering if you can help us and our audience get an understanding of what are these different viewpoints of Taiwan in Europe. Let's start there, as I have some follow-up questions.
Sure. And you're right. It is a very sort of varied picture when you look out over Europe. So some of the countries and people as well we worked with is very much in Eastern Europe. So you're seeing a sort of turn to Taiwan coming from Eastern Europe, coming to a large degree from a sort of their own reckoning with the communist past and saying, wait, China is actually a communist dictatorship. They're kind of bullying this little nation, Taiwan. So if you're in the Baltic countries or you're in Eastern Europe, you feel a kind of similarity with that. So in particular in Lithuania, driven by they're no longer in power, but when Landsberg is the then foreign minister, they sort of expanded the cooperation with Taiwan quite substantially. We've seen the same in the Czech Republic. Petro Pavel, the current Czech president, who we've also hosted at our Copenhagen Democracy Summit, he made more or less 2 calls when he sort of had been elected. One was to President Zelensky, and then the other one was with then President Tsai Ing-wen. And for him, this was like his moral compass of here the democracies, the frontline democracies that are under threat. But that's very unusual. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I put them out there a little bit as highlights. But of course, these are not the biggest countries in Europe. Mm-hmm. So if you look to sort of France, Germany, you have a much more sort of reticence about engaging with Taiwan. And of course, where it gets squared with Europe's economic relationship as well with China, what would this matter to, you could say, back in the zeros when I started working with China policy, we kind of had and failed the Dalai Lama test. That Dalai Lama at that time was still received by European prime ministers. I, in 2009, participated in the second to last sort of visit with the European prime minister and the Dalai Lama with the then Danish prime minister. And the Chinese each time put all these sort of soft sanctions on and isolation, and the countries never managed to sort of give a joined-up response until gradually sort of they peeled off the Chinese. More and more Europeans, they never dared to see Dalai Lama again. So somewhat similar with Taiwan, of like keeping sort of trying to redefine what's actually the red lines, so that it gets closer and closer to Beijing's one China principle, which says almost don't ever talk about something called Taiwan exists. And they of course try to push countries towards that. And I think you see a lot of countries that don't think that much, unfortunately, about Taiwan. So then if they're being pushed in some small situation by the Chinese, they might be kind of willing to go with it, or what's also called quite nicely preemptive obedience, where you think, oh, we should rather do this and not do this with Taiwan, because otherwise it could be bad for our business in China.
Can I ask you about your own country, Denmark? Right, you've worked for all the way up to Prime Minister of Denmark, Prime Minister Rasmussen, and also NATO General Secretary Rasmussen, separate Rasmussens.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, just in your personal experience, in your career, how you've seen this attitude toward Taiwan change, either just in Denmark, but also maybe just from the NATO perspective?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Denmark is like a little bit in the bad camp. So I wouldn't give them a lot of kudos. You could say what we do as a civil society initiative, and with the former Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen as my chairman in the foundation. There we include Taiwan, but from the government's point of view, they're very kind of reluctant and hold us, because of the Taiwanese, a little bit out in arm's length. And we also had this very strange change in Danish registration of Taiwanese on sort of their ID cards, which is something I've been opposing really vehemently, which unfortunately seems to be a case more of the category of like preemptive obedience. That is not something the Chinese have even asked for. It's something they suddenly kind of changed.
So no one even said anything. They just
yeah, exactly. It seems a mix of that and administrative kind of blunder that suddenly somebody went through. I think because of Palestine, went through what are countries and what are not, and then they suddenly said, oh, but if we run a one China policy, doesn't that mean that Taiwanese are semi-Chinese, which of course is completely blatantly false. But of course an uproar also in the sort of small but solid Danish Taiwanese community. So it's not, unfortunately, it hasn't completely trickled over to the government, and I think Denmark in many ways is a little bit of a microcosmos of Germany with relatively solid trade figures with China, and therefore of course a risk that what would it sort of entail on Danish businesses. I mean, again, I think it's wrong, and I think when you go down that path, you already sort of start the sliding slope where then the Chinese government will just pressure you more.
And I guess, you've kind of covered the range of how countries are engaging with Taiwan. What would you say are some of kind of the deciding factors for the countries that do engage? Is it that you need to have a top-level leader like your president have that moral compass to decide to do it? Is it having, a critical mass in the legislature? Is it the civil society? What is it?
I think all of the above, because I think the cases where the Chinese government has success then afterwards with their pressure, if they sense any sort of cleavages in government or among parties, then they of course try to use that and then sort of play for that. So even Lithuania, which I mentioned is really one of the solid countries, the fact that there's a little bit of discrepancy between the then president and sort of the prime minister and foreign minister on whether to do that, I think that made where Czech Republic, you really have a completely kind of united parliament like that. It's been really very much on that policy line, which might explain also why the Chinese have actually not had too many repercussions against the Czech Republic, even though they've clearly the country that gone furthest with the call with Tsai Ing-wen and so on, where the Chinese went much more after Lithuania, trying to sort of punish them. So I would say that Czech Republic is a good example of kind of standing strong and standing kind of united on it as well. I mean, the best would, of course, be if we did some of this at European level, that we just invited the Taiwanese to Brussels, and then they kind of met all of us there, and then the Chinese would have to decide, are we going to sanction like EU 27, which is our largest market? It, of course, for them only works if they can kind of use this sort of divide and rule playbook, and of course tell the other Europeans, oh yeah, but the Lithuanians are crazy and they do these things. We know you guys are sensible and so on, and you should just try to kind of rein them in.
That's a good point. I mean, individual countries, of course, have their own relationships with China and Taiwan, but from an EU, European Parliament, European Commission point of view, how have these multilateral institutions approached Taiwan policy, and how has that shifted since the war in Ukraine?
It definitely has shifted, but it's still, I would say, it's still a sort of debate amongst certain policy groups. So, so definitely the war in Ukraine sort of made people sort of reassess, wait, actually dictators kind of act on their impulses or on their ambitions. And that's what Putin did. And everybody can say, okay, maybe he has a completely distorted view of history and that Ukraine is his, but that's his view and he's willing to fight and put men in for it. So of course there is a growing, I would say, reevaluation also maybe of Xi Jinping of saying, okay, this is similar. He's telling us, all right, that he will make sure that Taiwan is, as he called it, reunified with China, and willing to use all means, including military means. So let's take him serious. So I think there is that dawning realization, but then there's also a little bit of sort of closing your eyes and just hoping it sort of, particularly because of the trade relations with China, and saying right now all Europeans are, the main priority is of course supporting the Ukrainians militarily and in all other ways so that they withstand the Russians. And that's why in that perspective, Taiwan can, of course, unfortunately, seem far away for Europeans.
And so I guess in your ideal world, ideal but still realistic, what would you like to see more European countries doing with Taiwan to help keep it secure? Where are places you think that real progress could be made?
I think one on the sort of the overall political with the whole, as we often call it, the status quo, which of course is no status quo because it's the Chinese military that constantly, and particularly since 2022, has been changing the status quo. I would love us to see Europeans challenge that much more instead of just putting out declarations about how important the status quo is, saying, well, but since it's China that's eroding it, we will sort of outline a step and series of actions that we will do each time we see that. And I think that could, to a higher level, also, for example, include military sales to Taiwan and sort of work with Taiwan on drones and other things that can help their asymmetric capability. Again, very few Europeans are there, but that's what I would like sort of I hope still in this sort of idealistic, realistic kind of frame. Then I think we should just have much more relations with Taiwan sort of overall, but that doesn't have all to be driven by government. That can also be in civil society, which is why I personally has also been part of that in Europe by bringing Taiwanese to the Copenhagen Democracy Summit kind of each year.
Yeah, I was going to say, what are some positive examples that you've seen of Taiwan-Europe cooperation in the last couple of years? What are good models to keep following?
Well, again, a lot can also be done, and I did already now cover a little bit the sort of the military political, but on business, I mean, of course, Taiwan has this hugely important for all of us nucleus around the production of semiconductors, particularly the advanced ones. And so that's where, for example, there is a collaboration now in Dresden about building a sort of semiconductor fab there, which is in tune with the sort of increasing regionalization, which has also happened in the U.S. with the production, TSMC production in Arizona and in Japan as well. So there, I mean, you see kind of economically as well that Taiwan plays this really pivotal role, and in Europe, like everybody else, probably mostly realized that during COVID, when suddenly we were missing chips in the production line, and then suddenly, wait, where they're actually produced? And then everybody was like, whoa, it's a large part of that is in Taiwan.
And do have a follow-up, actually. I mean, we talked a lot about governments, right? You said maybe a lot of Europeans don't think about Taiwan in the everyday. I mean, I can't necessarily blame them. They're not like Libby and me, and we think about Taiwan
probably more than
25/8 or 996 or whatever. How does the public perceive Taiwan? Has that changed in recent years? I mean, it could have also not changed, but what are some of the factors that also go into public opinion, right?
Well, I think for one, it's because of the Ukraine war come a little bit more on the map. Of course, a little bit I would say, as somebody that loves that in a negative way, in the sense that it's mostly about a Taiwan conflict and what does that mean for the world economy and kind of mean for us. So in that way, people have sort of gotten a little bit more awareness. But I mean, I would love that people, Europeans, discovered more about Taiwan, including going there as tourists, going there to study the language and sort of do more business and other links as well. Actually, there is, from my own country, there a huge economic link, which is that Denmark or Danish companies make a lot of windmills. And so the offshore windmills off the coast of Taiwan are sort of Danish. And I think it was 2021, or I probably say it in the book, or 2022. This was like Denmark and Danish companies were the largest overall investor. I mean, and this is a small country, so it's like larger than U.S. and Japan for that year, because of those huge sort of billion-dollar windmill investments. So I've also been argued locally or back in Denmark that, of course, we should translate that business interest into something a little bit more political. But that's, of course, where you can, again, ram up against kind of Chinese either pressure or just like that tacit preemptive obedience of saying, because had it been anywhere else on the globe and you had that major investment, there had been at minimum one or two Danish ministers that had passed by and said, and cut the ribbon and so on, and say, hey, we love to see Danish companies taking part of the energy transition in Taiwan, and that hasn't unfortunately happened because it's Taiwan.
Still an encouraging, I'm not even going to say small win. That's a big win, right, to have that
Big
level.
wind.
Yes.
Thank you for the pun. But I guess now that we've kind of finished grilling you on where things stand right now, I would love to think a little bit into the future. Thinking maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, obviously there are a lot of important years coming up, especially in kind of the CCP conception of history. So it's going to be a big 5 years. When you think about what a victory for Taiwan and democracies around the world looking like, what do you see?
Then I see a continued free Taiwan where the population keeps being able to cast their votes when there are elections and being able to sort of exercise their freedom of expression and basically live like they do now. I mean, that would be a big win, and it would be a big loss if 23 million people at some point, knock on wood, were subjected to the Chinese Communist Party in the same way that it's happened in Hong Kong. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of work against, and that it doesn't happen, that we all in different ways contribute to that layer of deterrent that makes Xi Jinping wake up in the morning and think it's not today that I'm invading Taiwan.
It's a great way to think of it, and thank you for fighting the good fight.
The last question we do want to ask you before asking about your recommendation is, the podcast, we try to talk about the range of opinions about Taiwan from Taiwan and elsewhere, and you're actually our first guest that is not, I guess, Taiwanese or private sector, right? You really do come from a foreign policy background from a different country. So if I were to ask you, if I were in Europe, even anywhere in the U.S. that doesn't think much about Taiwan, why should I care about Taiwan? Can you speak to what you would say? Is it the strategic importance for democracy? Is it something else? How would you answer that question?
That's a good one. It's actually when I go out with the book, this is precisely I say I point and then say this one the island is 8,000 kilometers, at least if you're in Europe, away from you. Why does this matter to you? It matters economically because of the semiconductor production, and at any conflict in Taiwan, I mean the economic numbers, the 3 trillion that Rhodium Group calculated, the 10 trillion that Bloomberg Media calculated. There are numbers, the 10 trillions are like the double of what COVID cost the whole global economy. So it's really large economic numbers. So in that way, I would say to any ordinary citizen, watch out for it at least, because it could have a huge impact on your economy. Then it's more or less the only place where you could also see a great power conflict between the U.S. and China unfold. And then thirdly, and that's of course the one that's mostly voting for me, it's a solid little free democracy, and 23 million people in Taiwan that exercise their daily right to be free. So I think it would be a much poorer and less freer world if Taiwan in its current form didn't exist.
Thank you for that. I'm very convinced.
It's a great elevator pitch, I have to say.
And lastly, Jonas, you obviously wrote a book about Taiwan. We've kind of alluded to it throughout this conversation. I do want to give you the chance to pitch your book. I think it's so awesome that, you from a Danish perspective wrote a book about Taiwan and why we should all care. Can you just give us your elevator pitch for your book?
Well, it was reviewed in Foreign Affairs in April, so do read that. It's a very short review, but kind of positive. And again, I think the story that I highlighted when we talked that touched me personally was writing about the Taiwanese volunteer soldiers and my interviews with them. So if you want to read it for one reason, I would say that's really where you get some geopolitics and some really strong personal stories at the same time.
Right, that's the battle for Taiwan.
With that, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, we always want to end our podcast with a more lighthearted, fun question, as you've probably seen in the previous episodes. So if I could ask you for your Taiwan recommendation, what would it be?
Yes, I knew you were going to ask that. So, I mean, if I can only do one, then I think I would choose Kimberly Chen, who is a Mandopop singer. She was at our Copenhagen Democracy Summit in 2022 and came because she had made a song together with a Malaysian rapper that was seen, and she was quite big at that time in mainland China. And that was seen as, or it was cut by the censors. So basically all her social media profiles in China as well was cut. And then we invited her and said, this is a very kind of concrete expression of sort of artistic freedom of expression. You can come to Copenhagen and sing that song. And so she did. So I encourage people to listen to that song. She did also make another song, Who Says, that she dedicated to all the democracy and freedom activists, not just from Taiwan, that were at the summit. So that one was like aired and world premiered on Spotify from Copenhagen. So I also recommend that one.
And you could say it's dedicated to you as a democracy activist.
Well, I think the ones that have, I would not put myself in that category. The ones that have real skin in the game, the Svetlana Tsikhanouskayas in Belarus, the Masih Alinejad from the Iranian women of women life freedom. So I would say rather to these individuals than to me, who's basically just a convener of all these extraordinary individuals.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really fun recommendation. All right, well, Jonas, it was such an honor for us to have this chat with you here in DC. Thank you for coming by. Please come back again. We'll see you next time.
Definitely. Always happy to be here.
Channing, what a wonderful conversation with Jonas. I think it was really a breath of fresh air to hear it from that European perspective and think about how maybe differently or the same they see some things.
Yeah, I mean, exactly your point earlier, right? Sometimes we're just so U.S. Taiwan or U.S. China minded, we forget all the other countries that are part of the equation. I mean, especially all the European countries, they obviously make up so much of the global economy, our democracies, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll be taking away, I think, as sort of a what can we do better? I think on the economic front, he raised a really important point about how both on Taiwan's side and on Europe's side, we can do better about explaining those concrete benefits that the Taiwan relationship has with these countries to people, right? He talked about the economic benefits from Danish companies investing in Taiwan and Taiwanese companies investing in Europe.
For the big wins.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, he made a great point that those are huge numbers that are going to have benefits going into the future. And I think being able to communicate that to people more clearly is something that we all need to work on.
Yeah, talking about a breath of fresh air, listening to him talk about his experience as a former diplomat and how much what China was doing or how China was reacting or what China could do and how much all of those factors still play a role in different countries' decision-making towards Taiwan. Like, I feel like we talk about Taiwan and the U.S. being friends so often that we still forget that at the end of the day, there is still that level of Chinese coercion. There is still that level of pressure that European countries feel and countries probably around the world feel from the CCP in terms of Taiwan. So while we can sit here and obviously agree that we need to work to help Taiwan, there is that very practical aspect, which is what China is doing.
Yeah, and I think he brought it home really well in the end in terms of sort of why it all matters, right? At the end of the day, it is about our democracy. It's about our shared values. It's about believing that those are things that are worth defending. I think it was very poignant that when he pointed out that a victory for Taiwan and democracies really was just sort of Taiwan being able to maintain its existing democratic way of life. China didn't even really factor into what that picture of victory looked like. And I think that that's a very important lesson for us all.
Well, sounds easy enough. Well, with that, thank you to Jonas again for joining us. Thank you for the copies of the book. Very excited to have a hard copy in my hands. And we look straight forward to seeing you next time.